Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and I'm sorry if this video takes a little while to get out. I'm currently on the road and staying with my mother while she's recovering from surgery, so this one might take a little bit longer for me to edit, or maybe I'll just end up doing it on my phone. I don't know. It's probably going to be pretty easy since I'm just working with audio and video clips, so maybe I'll do it that way. Anyways, that housekeeping aside, let me start by saying that in the past, I have talked about the ways that the media, especially the US media, tends to cover protest movements. The three ways that I identified in that video of how they go about this all revolve around how they fit into the perspectives espoused by that particular media network within the culture war. If it's advantageous to them within the culture war, they may act in such a way that seems supportive while trying to sand away the more radical elements through whitewashing and recuperation. The second reaction comes when the movement is in opposition to the media standpoint, in which case they will do their best to invalidate the efforts of the protesters by making them look stupid, evil, and/or corrupt. And in the rare cases where there is no obvious political advantage, they just get cursory coverage so that they can say they covered it and did their journalistic duty. Especially within America, it's pretty easy to know which way these things are going to fall, because we have pretty well-established lines within our political conversations that divide partisans up from one another. And while this phenomenon is relatively easy to explain within American politics, things can get particularly complicated when you start talking about foreign countries. In recent news, growing protests over the last 2 weeks in Iran are a good example of this. Because of our country's complex history of the Middle East, there isn't a clear way to spin this story politically without some potential for blowback. So for the most part, media companies haven't tried to dig into the story, as fascinating as it is. And I promise I will get into a bit of it myself, as well as bringing in some additional context that I found while researching the topic. If there is one branch of the American media that has at least attempted to cover this story, and politically probably has the most to cleanly gain from this, it's the liberal media. Largely, the story fits within the framework of countries crying out to be free in a way that America is a model that we have used since the beginning of the Cold War. While this isn't a particularly expansive viewpoint to look at this issue from, it does seem to have less to hide than the alternatives. Let's get into some of that coverage now, and I'll provide for you some additional context before getting into the reasons why the right-wing media is hesitating to cover this at all.
Now to Iran, where for the 10th night in a row, protesters, many of them women, have been clashing with state forces in nearly 100 cities. NBC's Tehran bureau chief Ali Arouzi joins us live with the very latest. Ali, what can you tell us?
Good morning, Mika. Well, the anger and the outrage in Iran is still palpable across the country. As protests continue to grow, unfortunately, so does the death toll. Officially, at least 41 people have been killed since the unrest began. However, Norway-based Iran human rights groups say at least 57 people have died, but say internet blackouts are making it difficult to confirm fatalities.
Extraordinary scenes in Iran, where protesters have taken to the streets for 10 consecutive nights in defiance of an unforgiving crackdown, threats, a near-internet blackout, and severe warnings from the country's leaders. Iran's president telling authorities they must deal decisively with those who oppose the country's security and tranquility. The protests sparked by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. She had been arrested by the country's morality police for an alleged violation of Iran's strict Islamic dress code. Officials released this video showing Amini collapsing, but it's unclear what happened beforehand. Police took Amini to a hospital where she died 3 days later. They deny mistreating her. Demonstrations continue nationwide, women leading the charge in a monumental movement. They are burning their headscarves, cutting their hair in public, facing off with riot police, and walking the streets boldly without a hijab, despite the massive, possibly life-threatening risks.
From this coverage, it seems like the mold that the liberal media is using to understand the story aligns with the way that they understood Black Lives Matter. And there are certainly similarities between these two movements, especially in that a member of a oppressed group within the country died while in police custody, which is not entirely dissimilar from the George Floyd incident that kicked off things in the United States. And to go further, I would say that both of these movements have a much more radical edge than many in the media particularly like to report. Although, admittedly, in the clips that I did find from the right-wing media, they did seem a little bit more willing to address this. And also European sources were a little bit more willing to address this as well.
Women burnt their headscarves and cut their hair in solidarity, while protesters also called for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's three-decade rule to come to an end. Some torched police cars and public buildings.
The women of Iran, they are not victim, and they are in the street to say we've never been victim. They try to make us as a victim. They try to control our body as an object of sex. They try to control our sexuality, our bodies for their ideology, for a theocratic regime. We are to say we are against theocratic regime. We don't want this regime. We want to overthrow this regime.
Mahsa has become a symbol of the oppression that women have been facing in Iran for 43 years. It's different this time because the country is united and they're all saying together, no more Islamic Republic of Iran. It's the Islamic Republic versus Iran. And we're here to support them, to do everything we can to be their megaphone, to be their echo chamber.
I suspect that they're uncomfortable in reporting this particular angle because many of them spent quite a while downplaying the radical aspects of Black Lives Matter. I personally think that this element is an illuminating aspect of both movements because it demonstrates that even though they were both kicked off by a single incident involving a single person, they both became emblematic of a societal yoke that a marginalized community has had to bear, and in both cases that marginalized community wants change that is more substantial than changing just one particular law. For instance, while a national law directing the police not to kneel on the necks of those who they arrest for 9 minutes at a time would have directly solved at least one of the problems inside the movement of Black Lives Matter, the recognition within the movement is that that is not the full extent of the issue that they recognize. Therefore, it would have been an appropriate response on some levels, but it would by no means be the systemic change that the movement was asking for. At the same time, a change in law regarding how women are allowed to dress in Iran would have addressed the specific reason why the woman in question was arrested. It would be very far from a solution that addressed the breadth of the enforced oppression of women within that country under the law. Like with many other things, they aren't doing a particularly bad job of understanding the problem necessarily. It's simply in concocting a broad systemic solution that they seem to lack imagination. European sources ended up being just better and fuller takes, as many of these countries have much less political skin in the game, at least with Iran. So that may not map onto other things that they do with the news and other stories, but in this particular case, they happen to be a lot fuller representations of what was happening than the news that we were getting in America at the time.
Iranian authorities have arrested thousands of protesters, and the NGO Iran Human Rights warned on Monday that security forces are using live rounds. The government has restricted access to social media, raising fears of an escalation in violence and making it difficult for the outside world to follow what's going on.
Internet is shut down in Iran, so that when the internet is down, they kill people in that silence easily. I have no more words to say. Everybody knows what kind of a country Iran is. We demand support from all, especially from women.
Demonstrators in Turkey, Iraq and Syria took to the streets in support of the Iranian protesters, while the French government denounced their violent repression. Canada hailed their bravery and announced sanctions against Iranian officials, including members of the morality police.
Back in Tehran, the regime is organizing its own demonstrations.
The protesters and rioters that took to the streets are not ordinary people. They are trained groups that have entered our country to destroy the ruling system. We definitely won't allow this to happen.
But there are fears that the state's response could go beyond counter-protests. Iran's Chief Justice called for security forces to respond to any further anti-government protests with force.
And here's a left YouTube comrade from the UK, Mutual Aid Works, with what I think is the best take of the video. And really, other than including actual conversations with people on the ground in Iran, which are hard to get out because of the internet crackdowns, I really think this covers all the bases that a good video on this should. So I'm gonna leave it in its entirety.
The Iranian Islamist theocracy is rightly in trouble due to the tragic murder of Mahsa Amini by the Islamist morality police. Mahsa travelled to Tehran from the Kurdish part of Iran and was picked up by the morality police for so-called improper hijab on the 13th of September. An absurd ordeal for all women in Iran, and the sort of thing that was stepped up by Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi, himself also responsible for mass repression and killings of political prisoners in the 1980s. The veil is compulsory in Iran, and millions of women face harassment, beatings, prison and being fined, etc., even if they are veiled, but it is considered by the morality police to be improper. In April, a man was shot by the morality police 4 times for attempting to defend his wife, who was being arrested by the morality police. Mahsa Amini was severely beaten and went into a coma and died in hospital on the 16th of September. X-rays revealed that she was beaten so intensely that her skull was fractured. Not just the morality police, but Raisi himself and the entire regime are directly responsible for her death. This has rightly enraged many people in Iran, the vast majority of who do not want to live in a theocratic state in the first place, and about 75% of who were not even alive when the Islamic Revolution happened. The regime is run by an out-of-touch clique of traditionalist old religious fundamentalist men. Though Mahsa's death is deeply sad, it has been heartening to see the courage of Iranian women standing up to the regime and burning their hijabs and veils, and it pleases us as anarchist communists and as human beings to see women and men of all ages uniting and defying the regime, with chants of women, life and freedom and death to the dictator, and calling for an end to an Islamic state. These are the largest protests and disturbances in Iran since 2009 and can be, in a sense, seen as feminist. And thankfully, it's not just the burning of veils and the chanting of slogans. This is outright revolt. A governor's home was set on fire in Amal, police stations have been set on fire in Mashhad, posters of leaders and ideologues of the Islamic Republic have been torn down and burnt, and morality police have been beaten up in Tehran. Police vehicles have also been trashed, and the unrest has spread widely. We acknowledge that religion divides, rules and falls and oppresses people, and that theocracy and patriarchy should not be tolerated. And even if we are realistic about the likely limitations of this revolt, we as anarchist communists are very glad to see the Iranian people coming together to stand up and fight back against theocracy and patriarchy. We should have solidarity with this uprising in whatever way we can, and we condemn the British government for its continued relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
There's also a take from Al Jazeera, which is based out of Qatar, which is probably closer to the political source and is a bit of a political oddity in the Middle Eastern media, being more closely aligned with, let's say, European liberal sensibilities than most of the Middle East.
Similar protests are spreading across Iran. In the northwestern city of Oshnaveh, demonstrators defied a warning by the Iranian army that it would confront what it called enemies of the state. Similar protests were held in the western city of Karamabad. Tehran has limited internet services to clamp down on the growing dissent.
The problem is if they switch off the access to international networks, to the global internet, then with the national internet or the national intranet, it's really hard to use those VPN services, safe messenger apps such as Signal.
The US government has eased export restrictions on software and some technology to Iran to widen online access, but analysts say it's unlikely to have an immediate impact. Several demonstrations in support of the government have also taken place in Iran. President Ibrahim Raisi says Amini's death must be investigated, but has called the protests acts of chaos.
They want to ride a wave and create riots and disturbances. They think with such moves they can stop the nation. We have announced many times that if anyone has a fair comment, we will listen to it. But anarchy, disturbing national security, the security of people, no one will succumb to this.
So far, though, the protests show no sign of dying down. Victoria Gatenby.
Much like recent news with Russia, it's not particularly a case that either side of the American political coin necessarily has an easy answer for that can kind of grapple with all the facts of the case. Democrats largely support the idea of building cooperation with the country of Iran, mainly through the Iran nuclear deal, while they would probably oppose most of the way that they actually go about running their country. Whereas the Republican side probably would agree with most of the way that they run their country, with both of them having a religious bent, and at the same time would find themselves at odds with the country itself, or the idea of negotiating with them, because they still largely think of them and much of the Middle East as just Islamic terrorists, and you don't negotiate with terrorists, I guess. I think this makes the little Republican coverage that there is of this particularly interesting, because they have to dance around the full breadth of the policy that is being protested here. And because a lot of the Christian nationalist base of our current Republican Party is advocating for a lot of the same things within our own country. I mean, I would say that a ban on abortion is a bit more invasive than having a woman wear a hijab. So, yeah. If they actually did talk about their disagreements with Iranian policy, generally speaking, they would likely find themselves in a place where their objections were largely semantic, which probably isn't a good look to share with groups that many supporters think of as extremists, or, as I mentioned before, just straight up terrorists. So let's go over to Fox Business, so that you can see the only example of this that I could quickly find, and I'm going to let this play out for a bit so that you can see that I'm not just cherry-picking something that he said here.
But I got to get your take on what I think is even a bigger story that's happening right now, and we're not really seeing a lot of focus on it, and that is these protesters on the street of Iran. The Iranians are calling for the end of the Iranian regime. At least 41 people have died during this unrest, including Iranian police officers. Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton joined me on Sunday on Sunday Morning Futures to look at this as a potential for leverage for the United States. He says, look, this administration should be taking advantage of the fact that the people are out chanting death to the supreme leader, but instead, this administration is doing the opposite. Watch this.
This is a moment to stand with the people of Iran. Yet Joe Biden is doing in these protests exactly what Barack Obama did in the summer of 2009 during the Green Revolution protest. He is standing idly by because he doesn't want to offend the Ayatollahs as he is trying to pursue this reckless nuclear deal.
General, your thoughts on that deal? Is it close? And is this a point to stop and reassess with all of these people in the streets?
Well, certainly that deal is stalled, but clearly Iran is moving towards a nuclear weapon with or without a deal, and we're on a glide path to a collision, certainly with likely a military option out of Israel, somewhat supported clandestinely by the United States. In terms of the protests, I think right below the surface, for years in the society in Iran, you have this festering frustration because of the lack of human dignity. I mean, can you imagine a regime telling you what clothes to wear and how to wear them? Is what the Iranians are doing. And obviously it's a denial of personal freedom, and the people are yearning for democracy. I mean, they were in the streets in 2019, Maria, over incredible gas prices, and over 1,500 were shot dead in the street. And the pattern is unfolding here. The facts are the people are protesting very aggressively, and the Iranians have shut down mobile phone service. Now they're shutting down the internet. And once that happens, then the police turn it over to the IRGC, the military, and they get in there and they begin to really shut this thing down by willing to kill hundreds, if not thousands, of people. That has been their pattern for years now. And they will do this because they cannot stand the threat of their people. Listen, the Iranian regime, Maria, fears their own people more than they fear the United States. They know that their regime could be put in jeopardy by the people, not by the missiles or airplanes from the United States, which they believe is likely not to happen. And the facts are, I agree with Senator Cotton here. The voice of the President of the United States needs to be strong and frequent on this issue, that the people on the streets know that President Biden and other world leaders have their back, much less like what Ronald Reagan did when the Poles were demonstrating against the communist regime in the 1980s. And Les Walesa heard the president's voice, and he had tears in his eyes when I was in a room with him many years later telling that story. So, yes.
Really seems like the right is also trying to take the first position of feigned support, especially with a lot of the recuperation and modification of the message in order to meet their personal culture war narrative. There's an attempt to make these people seem like heroes fighting a despotic government, while ignoring the animating philosophy of this movement is very much feminism. It would just be too much for anyone on Fox News to admit that feminism was fighting back against the Iranian government, because that would put them in a heroic position to the Fox News audience, which very much despises Iran and most of the Middle East as well. Problem being that they also despise feminism. So, This is their contradictory position that's very much like threading a needle, and I would imagine that's why you don't see more right-wing anchors trying to cover this. I'm even almost surprised that I haven't seen, like, Tucker Carlson doing a report on how feminism is ripping Iran apart or something. Like, that story seems like it kind of writes itself, but I guess maybe it's good that no one has done that yet. From the way that this is presented in this clip, though, the strongest case that he makes against the Iranian government is imagine how weird it would be to have a dress code as an adult. And I want to say I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of those points. It is fucking weird to have a dress code as an adult. I thought it was weird to have a dress code as a student. So I definitely think it's weird to have one as an adult. But rewatching this clip, the other thing that I find interesting is how in all of the protest footage that they're using, women are not prominently featured. Like, specifically this one that plays towards the end of the clip, you see a man very clearly being arrested. It's just like, this is a women's movement. If you wanted arrest footage, it feels like you would have had to pick through it to find them arresting men instead of women, but oh well. I mean, it really does very much seem as though they are hiding from the feminist nature of the resistance itself. But if you actually listen to the women on the ground directly, you'll get a different picture quite quickly. It also would force them to address the realities of what a theocratic government means for the people who live under it, which would undercut the message of a channel that is quite often pushing Christian nationalism within its own country. Living under government laws is one thing, and that alone can get problematic when people aren't democratically represented when those laws are formed. But under a theocratic government, there is no democratic ability to determine the laws of the nation because those laws are determined instead by long-dead, thousands-of-year-old prophets and the invisible man in the sky that they happen to align themselves with at the time. I want to make a few things clear, though. I'm not necessarily anti-religious. Life is tough, and if that's what helps you get out of bed in the morning, and if you want to live a restricted Orthodox life, and you want to wear a headscarf, a yarmulke, and a football helmet everywhere you go, because you believe that that's the best way for you to live, then I believe that you should have the right and freedom to live that way. But this is an inherently troubling way to run a government, because you're essentially being ruled by dead laws, as opposed to a democratic system where the laws, even if it might be a flawed democratic system, are alive and still malleable. The way that a government regulates a person's life should be as unintrusive as possible, while still providing maximum societal good. There are justifiable reasons, quite a few of them in fact, why government should have laws and should have certain restrictions on what people are allowed to do. However, I don't think that requiring a specific type of religious headgear or forcing an entire sex into a subservient position by law is justifiable, and instead feels arbitrary at best, if not an absolutely disgusting misuse of power and authority at the very worst. In saying this, though, I do want to make it clear that Islamic culture has not always been this way. Looking far back into the history, at the earliest attempt to form a pan-Arab nation was fairly inclusive and had carve-outs in the religious law for people who were not themselves Muslim. Even though these particular people did actually have to pay more in taxes for their additional privileges under the law. But it does show that a faithful Arabic nation need not oppress those within it under religious law. An example that longer time viewers might also remember is when I was talking about the 1970s and 1980s war in Afghanistan that was funded by the CIA. And the government that was put in place by the Communist Party that ruled the country prior to the CIA's intervention was not only a secular one, but also one that made one of its first priorities in advancing women's rights within the country. They made it one of their top priorities, even within the first years of the government. In modern history, especially, liberals tend to believe that the only way to establish such a government within the Middle East is through strong external control, in the way that we fostered such a government within Afghanistan while we occupied the country. Which is certainly not to say that they've reverted to such a government in our absence, likely because the strength of the movement that the CIA fostered in the 1970s and 80s in resistance is still having a tremendous power and sway over Middle Eastern politics today. We kind of paid for a whole lot of religious extremism, and they're still spending that money, basically. Or at least spending the political influence that they were able to buy with it. All of that being established as historical precedent, it is possible to see a future Iran that respects the rights of women, in addition to an Iran that sheds its own theocratic nature. And it's also possible to see that this is a potential future for all Arab states. And wouldn't that be nice? Also, if they could, get rid of the monarchy, that would be pretty cool. I don't think this is particularly a problem in Iran. They're run by an Ayatollah, and, well, he has been in power for 30 years, and it's probably about time that he stepped down anyways, so, I'm glad that people are finally calling for it, and that's largely the animating philosophy for why our right-wing general got into this. But the monarchy sucks as well. I'm looking at you, Saudi Arabia. But all of that aside, this is a future that is supported by the women who are dying in the streets right now to fight for it. So, after everything I've said so far, all I think I need to say now is that I admire their bravery in fighting and risking their lives for the future that they so desire. I just can't think of anything more heroic than that. Now, obviously, as I indicated in the beginning of the video, it's taken me a while to actually get this one finished up, and the media landscape in covering this has evolved quite a bit. And I think that the takes that we're seeing now are a bit better and fuller, even from America, but it is interesting to see how some of the biases that I highlighted earlier in the video still exist. For instance, what you're seeing on the screen right now is a Newsmax article, and I don't know what possessed me to click on this, but this is closer to right now when I'm posting the video. And even in this article, you'll see that they take basically the same tactics as the Fox clip that I noted before in just barely talking about what actually happened and trying to frame women out of the conversation. Whew. Thank you for tuning in. If you appreciate the content and the coverage, if you like the content, you should like the video. Do those YouTube things. Like, come on, man. We've had YouTube for how long now? Should I have to tell you to like a video? I don't know. Apparently, it helps. Also, if you could subscribe, and hey, I'm going to be putting some links on the screen. If any of you could send some money, that would be really nice. By no means is this a requirement to support the channel. I really appreciate the likes and subscribes as it is, but, they only buy so much. Anyways, I'm done begging for money. And now, I wish you, no matter where you are and what sort of a government you're living under, no matter what sort of media ecosystem you exist within, I want to leave you with the idea that things could be better. That you could, if not by yourself, but as a part of a group, as a part of a larger movement, that you could change those things for the better, much like women are trying to do in Iran. And maybe this is a big test. I mean, I think it is. Like, there's so many countries that are stuck in their ways, and in horrible ways. I mean, you've got the, any monarchy that still exists in the world, the theocracy that still exists in the Middle East, the dire late-stage capitalism existing in most of the world. I want you to take the time to imagine a better future, to imagine how you would personally get there and what you would do to advance the future that you want to see. And then give as much as you can of yourself, of your effort, to making that dream a reality. Because I think if we all come through just a little bit on making the world that ideal that we can see in our dreams, in our mind, in the just world that we think that humanity should live in, should have always lived in. If all of us take one step closer to that ideal, we will find that we have moved quite far as a group. So, remember, if there is nothing else, there is always